Hey y'all, Grandma Rose here. I want to talk about water again. I know the last time I talked about water, I talked about watering with chlorinated water from a municipal water system. But this time, I don't want to talk about that at all. I just want to talk about water. And when is the best time to water your garden? I think everybody has an idea about when they think is the best time to water their garden. Now, are they wrong? I think the best time to water the garden is in the morning. But I heard somebody else the other night say they thought the best time to water the garden was late afternoon, evening to night. Is he wrong? And I've heard other people say that it doesn't really matter when you water the garden. The main thing is you water when the plants need it. So neither morning nor evening. Afternoon is okay. Uh-oh, doggy's over here next to me and he knocked the tripod. So that's the question. Is there a best time to water the garden? I'm going to do a poll. Up there in the left corner, that way, I'm going to put one of those little eyes, do a card, and let's do a poll. We're going to do it right here at the beginning before we talk about it at all. So I want your opinion before I talk about it. And then at the end of it, you can see if maybe you've changed your mind. Or maybe you haven't at all, so it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter at all. So, there's going to be a four questions. Okay. Do you think the morning is the best time to water? Do you think afternoon is the best time to water? Do you think evening is the best time to water? Or do you say all of the above or none of the above? Let's say all of the above or none of the above will be the same. You know, in other words, you really don't have an opinion, or you think it really doesn't matter. And in that case, if it doesn't matter, then say all of the above. Okay. So, like I said, we're going to do a poll, and it's going to be up there in the left. Wherever that is. I can't figure it out. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about, after we've done the poll, I'll give you a few minutes to get that done. I'll talk about my dog. The dog's been bad today. I'm having a bad day today. He's been really, really, really bad today, and I'm not very happy with him right now. In fact, he stayed on his leash most of the afternoon, and I've got a 4-poster bed. Not high, not like a canopy bed, but I've got, it's not just a low bed. I've got posts on the ends of it. And I left him in his leash, and I hooked the leash around one of the bedposts, so he couldn't go anywhere. And, he was really pretty good. I think he slept most of the afternoon. And that kept me from being too mad at him. And that gave me some time to cool off a little bit. I don't want to talk about what he did. It was really bad. So, the next thing, now that y'all have had time to do your poll and decide what your answer is, I'm going to talk about there's three main ways to water, and then there's another way that's not necessarily a main way. And actually, there's probably more ways than that. But I would say the number, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and then we'll say whatever. So let's say number 1 is a soaker hose. Have you ever used a soaker hose? You know what it does. My dad used to use a soaker hose when I was a child, growing up, and he had a rose garden. I've talked about my dad before. Daddy was what would be a master gardener now. If they had a master gardener program back in the 50s and 60s when my dad was gardening seriously, he would be a master gardener. And in fact, I don't know if I mentioned before, when I did my introduction at the very beginning, I mentioned my dad growing roses, but did I mention that my dad was what they call, it was a consulting rosarian for the American Rose Society. And essentially what that is that's Ask the Expert. If you've got a question about roses, my dad was the person to call because he was the expert. And he worked with the American Rose Society answering questions that people had. So I got a pretty good background in gardening. Of course, he was doing flower gardening, but at the same time, gardening is gardening, and a plant that flowers is basically the same thing as a vegetable that sets fruit, because the vegetable that sets fruit has to have a flower first. So you want to do whatever you can to make that vegetable flower so it can then make the vegetable. Now I'm going to say fruit because botanically that's what a tomato is. That's what a pepper is. That's what eggplant. That's what a cucumber. All of these things, botanically speaking, are fruit. We're just the ones who decided that they have to be sweet to be called fruit. You know, it's just, if it has seeds in it, if it's a pod, if it grew from a flower, then it's considered a fruit. That's just the way it is. So you can argue with me if you want to, but that's the truth. So if he was growing roses and he was trying to grow them to make the best flowers that he could, to protect them from diseases, he used sprays. He used the commercial sprays and commercial fertilizers, but not all the time. He used a lot of manure. I remember one time he got fresh goat manure, and it was really bad. It stunk up the whole neighborhood, and all the neighbors were complaining. But yeah, my dad used fresh. He didn't have a compost pile, but he did know that manure was a better fertilizer than anything else he could do, and he mulched. So it's not like he was just a dirt farmer and didn't use any kind of mulches. He was using organic methods, but there weren't any organic methods at the time to cure fungal diseases, to cure black spot, which is a fungal disease, to cure other diseases, to kill aphids and all of the other. He didn't know about insecticidal soap and spraying them with water and all that stuff, but he was protecting his flowers from all of these diseases that vegetable gardeners protect their gardens from. So I got a really, really, really good background in gardening when I was very young. I'm not going to tell you exactly how many years old I am, but I can say that I can remember 60 years ago. I'm old enough to remember, which means I had to be at least 4 or 5 to remember, when my dad was gardening. And I learned when I was very, very young about the different things that you have to do to raise a good garden. Now, I didn't garden. He didn't have a vegetable garden, but he was a gardener. He was a flower gardener. And I didn't have a vegetable garden, a large vegetable garden for years. I grew a few tomato plants, a few pepper plants, all the things that we do. Maybe some cucumbers, some beans. But I didn't have a vegetable garden, a garden set aside specifically for vegetables until I moved here 11 years ago. It's almost 11 years, going on 11 years now. That's not that very long. But I have been a gardener my entire life. So I know a little bit, and then I specialized in it. I mean, botany is not the same thing as gardening, but then I did go through a Master Gardener program, so I'm a Master Gardener. Where my dad was, I am too. So, you go through the classes, and I'll do a video on that sometime about what it takes to be a Master Gardener. What kind of study do you have to do? What kind of testing do they do? All that kind of stuff. I think that'd be a good video sometime. So I'll do that. So we were talking about the kind of methods to water your garden. So I said the soaker hose is the first thing that I'm mentioning, because my dad used soaker hoses. He hardly ever used an overhead sprayer, but he used a soaker hose, and he used the soaker hose at night. Okay, but he worked full time, and the only time that he was ever home was late in the afternoon or on the weekends. And so if he was going to water his garden, he had to do it at night. And nighttime was the time that was best for him, and by using soaker hoses, he didn't wet the foliage. So that's a good reason to water at night. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, another way to water is a sprinkler. Now, we all know what a sprinkler is. We've seen sprinklers in just about everybody's yard, and there's all different kinds of sprinklers. There's the fan kind of sprinkler that does like this, and it sprays, and it sprays, and it sprays. And then there's the impulse sprinklers that go, those things. And there's all different kinds of sprinklers. But I think the main thing to think about a sprinkler is that you want the sprinkler to be above the height of your plants. So if you're watering your lawn, you can do one of these little sprinklers that sits on the ground, and that's fine. But if you're watering a vegetable garden and you've got tall plants, the best kind of sprinkler is going to be one of those that's on a pole. It's got like a tripod, and it sticks above the pole, and then it's high above the plants, and then you can sprinkle on top of your plants. Well, that's another way to sprinkle. That's another way to water. Now, a third way to water is a irrigation system, a drip irrigation system. And man, I wish I had a drip irrigation system, but they're more expensive than I can afford right now. So I have soaker hoses, but mostly I use sprinklers. You know, I just do. And I'll tell you how I do it and when I do it in a few minutes. But the drip irrigation system is very, very much like a soaker hose. It waters only at the root zone, but it's permanent. It's set in place. Where a soaker hose is portable. You can move your soaker hoses around. So if you have, like I do, I have like 3 or 4 different gardening areas. I have a garden out behind my house, out in next to the field, that has tomatoes in it. Tomatoes and basil. That's all that's in it right now. Then I have another garden. I call my kitchen garden, and that basically it's got my squash and some tomatoes and some peppers and beans and cucumbers. And what else? I guess that's pretty much it. I have some butternut squash planted in it, but it hasn't done much. And I've got the Cherokee tan pumpkins planted in there also. It's not a really large area, but it's enough for me, and I do have 30 tomato plants, so that's going to be enough for me to can a whole lot. And when I mention that to people around here, they think I'm crazy because I have that many tomato plants. I don't think they know anybody else that cans as much as I do. So then we get to the fourth thing. Now those are the 3 main ways to water. Well, there's, let's say, a fifth thing, and it's actually part of the overheads. It's not a sprinkler system per se, but if you're watering by hand with a hose and a nozzle on the end of the hose, and that's pretty much the same thing as a sprinkler system. But a sprinkler system. You can, that's another thing too. When I talk about the sprinklers, you can have your sprinklers that you move around, or you can have a sprinkler system that's set in place, and it works with a timer, and the timer comes on, and the little nozzle pokes up out of the ground, and it starts sprinkling. How many times have you ever passed by somebody's house in the rain and seen their sprinkler system going off? I have. Maybe if you don't live in a city, you might not have had the opportunity to do it, but I have seen that a number of times. And I always thought that is just so crazy, where people are so, they have this timer set, and they just don't think about looking outside to see if it's raining, and maybe they need to turn off the sprinkler. But that's neither here nor there. So the fourth thing I'm going to mention is, what if you don't have a portable water system? What if you don't have a hose? What if all you have is a well? What if all you have is a creek or a pond, and you have to haul your water from that off-site to your garden to water your garden? How can you do that? Well, one way to do it, and you've seen these in the probably garden catalogs, but you don't have to have a garden catalog to order something special to do it. Now, in a garden catalog, you can order like a funnel that screws onto the top of a jug. It can be a 2-liter Coke bottle or whatever. And you poke holes in the bottom of your jug, and you put this funnel on the top of it. You bury your jug in the ground, and then you pour water into the jug, and then the water seeps out through the holes. You bury it between your plants. So if you had 30 plants, say 30 tomato plants like I do, you would need probably at least 15 of these jugs if you're going to put them between, I say every other plant. So there's another way to water, and you don't have to stand there with the hose over it to water. So next thing I want to talk about is the 5 main garden watering myths. What are they, and why do we say they're myths? A myth generally means it's something that people believe, but it's not true. So I'm going to go through these, and I'm going to talk about them, and you can decide for yourself whether you think it's true or not. Okay, Number one, garden plants need an inch of water a week. They need an inch of water a week. Do you think that's true? How many times have you been told that your garden needs an inch of water a week? I hear you nodding your head. I hear you nodding your head. Yeah, I see you nodding your head. I hear you saying yes. Well, do any of you watch Deep South Homestead with Danny and Wanda King? Danny and Wanda live down in South Mississippi, approximately 30 miles north of the Gulf Coast, north of Gulfport, Mississippi. Their soil is extremely sandy, and in order for it to hold water, they have to heavily amend their soil with compost or other kind of mulches, dig in organic matter into the soil. Otherwise, the water's just going to run through it like a sieve. So, in sandy soil, you need probably 2 inches of water a week, maybe more. If you haven't amended your soil with compost or other things, organic matter, to make it hold the water, then there's a good chance you're going to need more than an inch of water a week. Now, where I live, I also live in Mississippi. Where I live, we have heavy clay soil. And my heavy clay soil holds water like crazy. Now, there's a chance that I might not need an inch of water a week because the ground holds the water. It doesn't drain out like it should. So just like Danny and Wanda King need to add compost and other soil amendments to make their sandy soil hold water, I need to add compost and other soil amendments to make my clay soil drain. So I might need to use less than an inch of water a week. Now, another reason you might not need to use an inch of water a week is if you mulched. What if you have a back to Eden garden? Does everybody know what a back to Eden garden is? Essentially, a back to Eden, well, there's two different words, two different names besides back to Eden for that method. The first thing, the old name for it was sheet mulching. Sheet mulching. In other words, instead of mulching deep, you're mulching layers, and you're putting a sheet of this and a sheet of that and all over the ground, and you're layering. It's like layering your compost on the soil in layers. So another name for that kind of mulching is called lasagna gardening. And it's called lasagna garden because you're doing it in layers, just like lasagna, where you've got your meat sauce and your cheese and your noodles and all the different stuff that you have, and then you repeat the layers. So sheet mulching and back to Eden gardening is also called lasagna gardening. Well, this kind of mulching, with a deep mulch particularly, holds the water in the soil. And can't think what the man's name is that originated it. Lives in Washington, and I will put a note with what his name is, and I've gone blank on it, but I know I can see him, I can picture him. He walks with a cane, and he's had this back to Eden garden for a very, very, very long time. And he says that you don't really need to water it. Water it heavy a couple of times. You don't need to water it again. So there you go. Does everybody need an inch of water a week? So I'll say yes. If you have an average garden, average mature plants, if you have seedlings, if you're starting seeds and the seeds haven't germinated yet, if you have seedlings, if you have transplants, you're going to need to water it more often, maybe more shallowly. But you can't water just once a week heavily and get an inch of rain, or those transplants or those seeds aren't going to germinate. The transplants are going to die. Your seedlings are going to die. You've got to water more often to keep, and you may end up watering total of more than an inch a week. Maybe less, because you might only want to water maybe an inch deep or so, just deep enough for the roots to go, because you want to get your plants started, but then you also want to water deeply so they can get a root system developed. So there's number one. I've talked a long time about that. Number one. So the second myth is that wilting, when a plant wilts, it's a sign that it needs water. Is it time to water your plant when your plant wilts? Well, yeah, I always thought that when your plant needed water, it wilts. Well, yeah, when your plant needs water, it wilts. But are there some other reasons why a plant might wilt? Have you ever seen a plant that has too much water? What does it do? A plant that has too much water wilts. Have you seen a plant that has a damaged stem? What happens to that? A plant that has a damaged stem wilts. So the first thing you need to do, if you see your plant wilting, you need to stick your finger down in the soil and see, is the soil wet? How wet is the soil? How deep is the soil wet? If it's wet an inch down, is that enough? You might need to go down several inches. In fact, watering deeply is very, very, very important because you don't want to have a shallow root system. We talked in the video about the chlorinated water, how important it is to have a deep root system. Well, number one, if you have a drought and you have a shallow root system, your plants are going to die because the roots are at the top of the soil. You need to have a deep root system to support the plant and to keep it alive if you have a lack of water. So there you go. Wilting, yes, wilting is a sign that plants need water, but that's not the only thing that wilting means. So you need to check. You stick your finger in the soil and that soil is soggy. What are you going to do? Well, for one thing, you're not going to water it anymore, and you're going to do everything you can to get that water to drain off of it. And then if it's neither too wet or too dry, then you need to start looking at your plants to see if there's some kind of damage to your plants. Okay, now the third thing. Now this is something that everybody has heard. I mean, I know I've heard it before. And that is that you never want to water your plants overhead in the middle of a hot sunny day. Anytime during a hot sunny day, because what's going to happen? Those droplets of water on the leaves are going to act like little magnifying glasses, and they're going to concentrate the rays of the sun, and they're going to cause brown spots on your leaves. Is that true? No. Think about if you lived in a tropical area and you had rain every afternoon. What do plants look like in tropical areas? What about South Florida where it rains? You can almost guarantee that it's going to rain every day. What do the plants look like down there? Do you see a lot of burn spots on their leaves? And what about you have an afternoon shower? What does it do to your plants? What do your plants look like after an afternoon shower? What do you do to dry your plants off so they don't burn? No. If it's hot and sunny, that water that comes from that afternoon shower or from your sprinkler system is going to evaporate more quickly than it would take for any kind of the sunlight to be focused on that plant to burn it. So don't worry about that. That's not going to happen. Okay. Now another thing that I've heard, this is the fourth myth, and that is it's a bad idea to water overhead in the heat of the day. Not so much because you're going to burn your plants, because the water droplets are going to act like magnifying glasses, but because it's too hot and that water is going to evaporate and you're going to waste water. If you water in the middle of the day with a sprinkler system, okay, sprinkler system, and we're going to get back to drip irrigation and soaker hoses in a little bit. But if you have a sprinkler system, an overhead sprinkler, a hose, whatever, and you water your plants in the middle of the day, yes, that water is going to evaporate. And yes, it's wasteful. And yes, it's going to evaporate and you're going to have to put twice as much water on it to get the same amount into the ground. However, there's reasons that you might want to water it in the middle of the day. What if you're having a really extended, hot, dry spell? those plants might enjoy a little cool shower to cool them off a little bit. What if you've had a drought and it's dry and dusty? All the leaves on all of your plants are coated in dust. Well, don't you think maybe it's a good idea to wash off that dust? Yeah. So if your leaves are dusty, wash off the dust, because what the dust is going to do is going to block the rays of the sun, where the chlorophyll in the leaves is not getting enough sunlight for photosynthesis. It's not going to photosynthesize as well with dust on the leaves. And that's one reason why on a dry, dusty day, why the plants look so much happier after an afternoon rain, because they've washed off all that dust on the leaves and they are healthier. They're able, something else you probably didn't know. Did you know that plants have pores in their skin? I say skin. They have an epidermis. Our epidermis is called our skin. Well, plants have an epidermis too. It covers their stems, it covers the leaves, it covers all parts of the plants. And in the epidermis are holes, or pores. And their pores are called stoma. Stoma is the singular. Stomata, it's a Latin word, so stomata is the plural form of stoma. So plants have stomata in their epidermis. And what the leaves do, the plants breathe. Now you don't think about, the plants they do have respiration. But respiration is the word for burning up their nutrients and using the nutrients that they've taken in, using the food that they've taken in to produce sugars. That's called respiration. It's not the same thing as our breathing. Botany lesson. But animals have respiration too. That's what it's called when you are digesting your food and turning the food that you have eaten into food for your body, into starches and sugars that your body can use. So the plant takes in, we know the plant takes in carbon dioxide from the air. How does it take in carbon dioxide from the air? It takes in carbon dioxide through the air, through their stoma, in their stems and in their leaves. And it needs the carbon dioxide. That's their carbon source that they use in photosynthesis to produce sugars. They also take in oxygen. So that's number 4. So yes, it is okay to sprinkle your plants overhead in the middle of the afternoon, especially if they need the water, if they need to wash off the leaves. It'll help them with photosynthesis. It'll help them be able to take in carbon dioxide that they need for photosynthesis. Okay, the last thing, number 5, is that drought-tolerant plants don't need any extra water. Well, do you grow any drought-tolerant plants in your garden? I can't think of any drought-tolerant plants that I grow in my vegetable garden, but I can think of drought-tolerant plants that I grow in my herb garden. Most Mediterranean plants are relatively drought-tolerant. Oregano, thyme, Echinacea. Now, Echinacea is a native plant, but these plants are considered drought tolerant. And yes, once they're established, they don't need as much water as other plants, but they're going to benefit from it. But that first year when you plant them, they need a lot of water to get their roots established, get their roots down deep, so they can do without this external water. So there you go. There's 5 myths. And I think we pretty much debunked these 5 myths. But that's pretty cool. Okay. So what is the best way to water? What are actually the best ways to water? Okay, the first thing, the most important thing is to focus on the root zone. Down near the soil level. If you focus on the root zone, then you're not going to waste as much water. It's not going to evaporate as quickly as if you're getting it down near the soil. It has time to soak into the soil quickly. Then you're not going to waste as much water, and there's a chance that you might have to use maybe half as much water as you would by another method if you can water down near the root zone. So there, I mentioned that we would get back to drip irrigation and soaker hoses. That's the best way to water the root zone. And also irrigation, not just drip irrigation. That's another method of watering that we didn't mention before. So that's actually a fifth way to water. Would be by pouring the water onto your plants, where the water flows through your garden, say through trenches between your plants. Say you've got your plants planted on a hill, at the top of the hill, then there's going to be low places between the hills. And you can run the water down through those hills, and the water will soak into your ground. So that's another way, and that's another form of irrigation. Okay, the second way is to water only when you need to water. Don't water automatically with a timer every week at the same time. If you need to check your soil. Is your soil dry? Do the plants need water? If they need water, then yeah, water your plants. The next thing is when you do water, don't water shallowly, because that's going to create shallow roots and your plants are going to be stressed in dry weather. You need to water as deeply and as thoroughly as you can. So you might need to, let's say you have a sprinkler system. How do you know if you've given it an inch of water? How do you know if you have whatever kind of system, how much water you've given them? One way to do that is to say put out a tuna can. Put out some kind of vessel in the middle of your garden in an area that's kind of an average water area. And then you can measure the water in that can. How long did it take for the water to reach the level that you need it to? And then you need, let's say it took an hour to give your plants an inch of water. And you have that average soil and the average plants that you only need an inch of water a week. Then you know that at a certain time, you choose the time that you need to turn on that water, and you have to leave it on for an hour. And if you do it less than that, the plants aren't going to get as much water as they need. Okay, now the next thing, now this is going to be something that people might disagree with. The best time to water is in the morning. Now, yes, you can water at night. My dad watered at night. There was a reason why he watered at night, and he used soaker hoses. The water didn't splash up on his plants. He used soaker hoses, so the water didn't splash up on the leaves of his plants. So what you need to do is you need to water at a time of day where the plant's leaves are wet for less than 9 hours. And when you're doing that, you need to take into consideration dew that's on the leaves. What time of day does the dew fall on the leaves? Okay, there was an article by a plant pathologist, Mississippi State, and he said that you should not water between 6 o'clock at night. I'm talking about overhead water. You shouldn't water between 6 o'clock at night and midnight, because the dew is going to fall on the plants. Number one, it's going to be cool. The water's not going to evaporate. The second thing is the dew's going to fall, and then the leaves are going to be wet even longer. And he said, now this is the plant pathologist, and he says it takes about 9 hours for a fungal spore to germinate, and about 9 hours for bacterial cells to proliferate. And so you want your plant leaves to be dry you don't ever want them to be wet for more than 9 hours, because that's asking for fungal diseases. Have you ever heard of blight, southern blight, that affects tomato plants? It's the one that happens most often if it rains at night and the water splashes up on the plants, on the leaves. There's bacterial wilt, so of course that's a bacterial disease. Black spot is a fungal disease. Powdery mildew is a fungal disease. So any of these fungal diseases, and there's lots more of them, But if your leaves are wet for longer than 9 hours, then there's a chance that these fungal spores are going to germinate and you're going to have disease problems. So that's why the best time to water is early in the morning. Give your plants time for the leaves to dry off. The next thing is mulch. That's very, very, very important. And not just for flower gardens. I think flower gardeners may have been mulching longer than vegetable gardeners. But mulch is just as important in a vegetable garden as it is in a flower garden. And the more you mulch and the deeper you mulch, the more water it's going to hold into the soil. It's going to cool the soil. So on a hot, sunny day, the soil's not going to be as hot. And it's also going to hold in the moisture in your soil. So mulch is really important. And the last thing is to use the right tools. Now, I'm not talking about shovels and hoes. I'm talking about what kind of hose do you use? Do you have a soaker hose? So you need the right kind of hose. If you have a drip irrigation system, you need to have a timer, because it's going to be easier for you to have, not even a drip irrigation system, any kind of irrigation system, you need to have a timer, because you're going to determine how long it takes the plant to, or the watering system to provide the amount of water that you need. So get a timer, and and there are timers that you can put on your faucet. You don't have to have one of these fancy irrigation systems to use a timer. There are gardening companies all over the place, and you can get a timer that you can put on your hose at your faucet on your house, and you can set it to turn the water off at a particular time. And a last thing would be a rain barrel. I would love to have a rain barrel, and I don't have a rain barrel. And I really want to have a rain catchment system, because I would really like to be able not to depend on my municipality and my water treatment system. I don't have a well. There is a well on my property, but when the county we live out in the county, and when after the city got municipal water, and they finally were able to hook up people out in the county to the water system, the people who built this house shut off the well. They sealed up the well. They disconnected the power to the pump. The well is out there, and if I got a pump, I might be able to have well water again. So that's pretty much it. So I want to ask you again, when is the best time to water? Do you think the best time to water is at night? Do you think the best time to water is in the middle of the day? Do you think the best time to water is in the morning? I think you be the judge of that. Whatever is the best time for you is the best time to water. It needs to fit your schedule. So is there any one particular time that's the best time to water? That's up to you. It's your judgment call, and there is no gardening policeman who is going to come and give you a ticket because you didn't water at the right time of day. So I want to leave you with that. Bye, y'all. See you next time.